Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this beautiful sunny day outside Sunset Center, and we'll try to make it really sunny for you inside as well. It's my great pleasure this season at all these lectures to say welcome to the 75th Annual Carmel Bach Festival. It feels so wonderful to say that. Thank you for being here and being part of it. My name is David Gordon, and most of you probably by this time, I feel like I'm in a room full of friends when I stand here. For those of you who know me, I was going to say for those of you who don't know me, I've been associated with the festival for a long time, and for those of you who do know me, I've been associated with the festival for a long time. I first appeared here in 1983 as the St. John Passion Evangelist, and I've sung and acted and spoken and lectured and done just about everything that can be done. I even change the toner in the laser printer in the office sometimes because I can. I want to talk to you today about Handel, about the piece of music you're going to hear. And today, of course, this is the second year that we've had what we call the Carmel Commission, where we commission a composer to write a piece of music to be placed in one of our concerts. And you're going to hear that premiere, that world premiere today. And the gentleman who wrote the music is here in the room, and I'm going to introduce him, and we're going to have a chance to hear a few words from him. Curt Cacioppo will also be lecturing tomorrow, a fabulous lecture at 4 o'clock, but I thought it would be great for us to actually meet the man whose music we're going to hear, whose music the world is going to hear for the first time at about 3:40. First of all, I want to thank once again AMP 27, Access Monterey Peninsula TV, Channel 27. This is a community access TV station that involves the community in the making of TV shows and in TV production. And they are videotaping all of our lectures and free events this year and live streaming them on the internet. My picture and your sound of laughter, applause, and coughing is on the internet right now, theoretically around the world. And these lectures are then archived on the AMP website. And I was very, very flattered and delighted to hear that in leading up to this year's Bach Festival, AMP 27 has been playing last year's lectures. For the first time in my life, people have been coming to me and saying, I saw you on TV. It's thrilling, actually, and I'm really happy for it, and I want to thank the guys at AMP, and I want to thank our member of our technical staff, Jason Mariani, who is managing this project for the second time. He's the guy who gives me the rundown when it's time to start. So thanks to AMP 27, thanks to all the work that goes into putting this together. I also want to remind you that in the upper patio of the Sunset Center is a raffle, an art raffle that we call the Art of Music. It's becoming a tradition now. This is the fourth year for it. It features this year over 125 miniature artworks inspired by the natural beauty of our region and by the experience of the Carmel Bach Festival itself. And these artworks are donated to the festival by the artists, and the proceeds go directly 100% to the festival. The exhibit itself is a work of art. It's about 150 feet from the lobby in the upper patio. Please take a look as you listen to the Tower Brass this afternoon before today's performance. You can buy tickets from any of the festival volunteers wearing bright red aprons. They're very hard to miss. I'm hoping that a few will be down here in this room at the end of the lecture so that you can connect with them. And I happen to know the tickets are $5 a piece, 7 for $30, and you get a free ticket if you buy a program book. So it's a wonderful, wonderful raffle, a wonderful way for our festival to raise money, a wonderful way to get some lovely little artwork pieces on your walls at home. We have one, and it's terrific. We love it. So we get into now a discussion of one of my two favorite composers to talk about. They are, of course, Bach and Handel. And at last night's lecture, I talked about Bach the employee. Were many of you here for that lecture last night? And I reinforced the fact that Bach was an employee, and he actually had a tendency to be a kind of an obsequious employee. Bach was not at all comfortable socializing with people above his station. And his socioeconomic station, Bach's, was not particularly high. The odd thing is how different Bach and Handel are. And I'm always happy to talk to the same group of people about both composers back to back, because the differences are enormous in their personalities, their career paths, and their music. When it comes to Handel, I find it an amazing turn of events in the history of Western music that the composer who created the most beloved choral music in the English language, I'm thinking of Messiah, Samson, Solomon, Alexander's Feast, Jephthah, the most beloved choral music in the English language, the man who created it was actually a German whose real passion and fame in his lifetime were as a composer of Italian operas. It's such an odd story. Handel wrote more than 40 operas, and we now consider him to be what some did then, although he had a lot of competition. We now know that at this time, the first few decades of the 1700s, Handel was by far the greatest opera composer alive. He also created some of the most delightful and engaging keyboard and orchestral music. He pioneered the organ concerto, beautiful other concertos, a wide array of music. He was a renowned organ virtuoso himself, and more about that in a few minutes when we discuss the format of today's concert. But until a resurge, an upsurge in interest in his operas, bless you, an upsurge in interest in his operas in the last several decades, he was largely remembered for one particular musical form, the oratorio, to which he resorted late in life and only when opera in London fell out of favor. We define oratorio as a large-scale musical work for orchestra and voices, which is very typically, most typically, a narrative based on a religious theme. It is performed without the use of costumes, scenery, or dramatic action. In other words, the singers, dressed in their formal finery, stand there and sing. Well-known examples of this oratorio format include Bach's Christmas Oratorio, Handel's Messiah, and Haydn's Creation. It's a format that we know very well at this festival. The style of performing the Passions is known as an oratorio passion, for example. Alexander's Feast, by this definition, is not really a true oratorio because it is not based on any sacred text. It is based entirely on a secular poem which depicts a secular event. Nonetheless, the secular works, the non-sacred concert works that Handel created during this last period in his life are generally included under the heading of oratorio because they contain all the building blocks, the orchestra and the voices and the stationary position on stage. They contain all the building blocks except the actual sacredness of the text itself. So, to lead us up to a discussion of today's concert, let me tell you the wonderful story of Handel's life. Georg Friedrich Handel was born on the 23rd of February, 1685, in Halle, Germany. He was born 4 weeks before Johann Sebastian Bach. They were born a few hundred kilometers apart, and they never met. Their two lives, as I said, could not possibly have been more dissimilar. Bach was the son of a poor city musician, a Stadtpfeifer, a trumpeter, in the town where Bach was born. His family was not wealthy at all. He was orphaned at an early age and forced to earn his way through life beginning in his late teens. Handel, on the other hand, was the son of a prominent surgeon at the court of the Duke of Saxony. Handel's father hoped for a career in law for his son, but he did allow his son to study music privately with organist Friedrich Zachau, who was a composer familiar with the then very modern and trendy Italian style. And he apparently gave the boy a good foundation in composition and music theory and instructed him in organ, harpsichord, and violin. By the age of 13, Handel was already composing cantatas for performances in churches, and at 17, he was appointed organist of the cathedral in Halle. In 1703, at the age of 18, Handel moved to Hamburg, where he was a violinist in the orchestra of the Opera House. Within a year, when he was about 19 years old, he had become a conductor at the Hamburg Opera. He directed productions from the harpsichord. He became increasingly influential in the artistic direction of the company. He had not yet turned 20. He composed his first operas during this time in Hamburg, just before and after his 20th birthday. He left the opera in 1706, just before his 21st birthday, when it became apparent that he would not be appointed music director, that he would be passed over. I can only imagine someone as talented as Handel, someone as large and tall in physical stature, could possibly have been a little overwhelming. Geniuses can often be very hard to live with. His fabulous success at the Handel Opera, at the Hamburg Opera, which would have become the Handel Opera if he'd taken over, the fabulous success in the Hamburg Opera was typical of his entire career. He created a big musical sensation wherever he went, wherever he was working. And he also had an amazing ability to do what we call today schmoozing and make influential social connections. Without Twitter or Facebook, he was able to network. The great 18th century journalist Charles Burney met and knew Handel and describes him thusly: Handel's general look was somewhat heavy and sour, but then when he did smile, it was like the sun bursting out of a black cloud. There was a sudden flash of intelligence, wit, and good humor beaming in his countenance, which I never saw in any other. Friends and eyewitnesses, including Charles Burney, describe Handel as polished, impeccably mannered, a gentleman who spoke 4 languages fluently, although all with a heavy German accent. He was completely at ease with people in any socio-economic strata, including royalty. For example, while in Hamburg, Handel made the acquaintance of the Grand Duke of Tuscany, and the Duke suggested a visit to Italy. If you've ever spent time in Hamburg, you know that after a while, a visit to Italy seems like a very wonderful thing. The weather can be very gray in Hamburg. So he leaves his work at the opera, just about the age of 21 now. He heads south for 4 formative years in Italy, and these are the years that totally transform Handel's output and set the course of the rest of his life. His 4 years in Italy, 1707 to 1711, had a profound influence on his music. Italy was at that point the musical capital of Europe. Everyone who wanted to study music, everyone who wanted to study singing or violin playing went to Italy. The Italians didn't need to go anywhere. Everybody came to them. And Handel just threw himself into the whirlwind of musical and cultural life in Italy. He quickly built a reputation as an organist and harpsichordist, both for his technical virtuosity and for his amazing improvisational abilities. The one thing I want to talk to you here about for a moment is this idea of improvisational abilities. When we speak of improvising at the keyboard, this was a very important skill in the High Baroque, which means that someone, and jazz players do it today, someone from the audience will whistle out a tune, and the jazz player will begin to riff on that tune. You know how jazz players do that, and they'll play it this way, and they'll play it that way, and they'll twist it around and do different things with it. This was an enormous, important skill for Baroque keyboardists. Bach was famous for his ability to improvise. Handel was another one whose ability to improvise at the organ was absolutely brilliant. He and Scarlatti had an impromptu improvisation contest in public in Italy, and Handel won, according to the witnesses at the time. While he was in Italy during these 4 years in his early 20s, he wrote lots and lots of vocal music, including operas, sacred works, and numerous cantatas, but he became most importantly familiar with a particular kind of production that had been developed in Italy and was very popular there, and it was called oratorio. Italian oratorio had become a kind of replacement for opera, especially in Rome, because at that time operatic performances in Rome were periodically banned by the capricious Pope in the Vatican. And so Handel figured out a way to use this oratorio format to showcase his operatic skills as a composer. An oratorio, of course, is a sacred drama with recognizable characters and storyline. And in fact, at that time in Italy, they were staged in theaters, but they were fully staged with scenery, costumes, and acting. It was a total fake opera. It was faux oratorio because they weren't allowed to perform opera in Rome. During his time in Italy, Handel wrote 2 such oratorios in Italian. The first performance of his oratorio La Resurrezione, the Resurrection, was a really impressive event. With expensive scenery, an enormous orchestra led by the great composer Arcangelo Corelli, one of whose concerto grossos we hear on our Monday night concert. And Handel wrote an extensive violin solo for that. So he had his first taste of this idea of Italian oratorio, and also his first real taste of Italian opera. He attended the opera in Florence, he attended opera in Bologna, in Venice, in Milan. He was the toast of the town, and he saw that this was a future career path for him that made lots and lots of sense. Here's another example of how he manages his career. On one of his trips to Venice, Handel made the acquaintance of the brother of the Elector of Hanover. Now, if you remember what I said last night about the Elector of Saxony, the Elector is the prince who rules a region of Germanic Europe, which was called the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor of the Holy Roman Empire sat on the throne in Vienna. This was the Habsburg lineage at this time. And these various princes reported only to the emperor. But they were the final say in terms of the government and ruling of their particular territories. And so the Elector of Hanover was someone of particular interest to Handel. At this time, London was becoming the new musical capital of the theater and musical and operatic world. And Handel saw an angle that he could play. He made a trip to Hanover, and with the recommendation of the Elector's brother, Handel was appointed Kapellmeister to the Elector of Hanover. Now, Kapellmeister is a word that we use a lot in this room. It means literally master of the chapel or master of the capella, which is the musical organization that plays music in the chapel. It's an ancient and honorific title that has real work involved with it, which it means basically that you are in charge of all the music at the court. Why on earth leave sunny Italy for cold and gray northern Germany, you ask? The choice of employment at Hanover as Kapellmeister seems even more bizarre since there was no opera at the court. It had very little money, and there was very little music at the court. The post of Kapellmeister was largely ceremonial and actually was created especially for Handel. But he had a plan. Shortly after he arrived in Hanover, he received permission to travel to London. He actually got a paid leave of absence for 1 year upon starting work in Hanover. He traveled to London and he was to remain there for the rest of his life. Why go to Hanover first, get this position that carries with it no duties, and then go to England? The answer lies in the complicated politics of Europe in the early 18th century, and in the arts and culture of London at that time as well. Georg Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, was born in 1660 and died in 1727. And here is the clue, ladies and gentlemen. Georg Ludwig was the great-grandson of James I of England. Queen Anne was ill in London. She was destined to die in a year or two, and she was the last monarch in the Stuart line. Georg Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, who spoke only German, stood next in line for the throne of England. Queen Anne had been very careful to keep him out of English politics. She wouldn't even let him journey to England in his legitimate role as a member of the House of Lords. Handel's trip to London in the employ of Georg Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, before he became King George, served both the Elector's interests and Handel's interests. Handel was a sort of advance man for the future king. He was an advance man for the planned arrival of King George in Italy. Handel, because his father had been a doctor, was very acquainted with medicine and also was a very erudite and delightful and influential man. And he struck up a friendship immediately with a man named John Arbuthnot, who was an amateur musician but also happened to be the personal physician to Queen Anne. And Handel was able to send information secretly back to Hanover about the state of Queen Anne's health. Upon her death in 1714, Georg Ludwig of Hanover became King George I of England and Ireland, the father of King George II and grandfather of George III. Handel became his Kapellmeister in London and would remain such for the rest of his life for George I and then for George II. Georg Friedrich Handel also became a naturalized English citizen. He signed his name many ways during this period, but perhaps inspired by his patron, the former Elector of Hanover, he seemed to settle on the same name that Georg Ludwig is George. And so he spent 50 years residing in England. He spent much more than half his life there, and he called himself George Friedrich Handel, not Georg Friedrich Handel. I have to be very careful because my German friends, where I have lectured on this subject, are very touchy about whether or not Handel was a British composer or an English or a German composer. If you look in the reference books, however, you will see George Friedrich Handel If you look in the musical reference books, you will see George Friedrich Handel described as an English composer born in Germany. Think about that now. He spent more than half his life in England. He anglicized his English name. Is Henry Kissinger an American? That's not a rhetorical question. When do you become an American? So that's why I love to say that Handel was a great German. He was a German composer. He was one of the greatest German composers. He was one of the greatest. Thank you. We're just going to go with this. Okay. Thank you. Let's have a round of applause for Jason. There we go. There we go. Okay. All right. There we are. Okay. Thank you. This will help me now when Curt gets up here too. Handel was one of the greatest German Baroque composers. He was one of the greatest Italian opera composers, and he was one of the greatest English Baroque composers. How could one man be three things? London, where he flourished for decades. George Friedrich Handel. London had, in the early 1700s, developed an insatiable appetite for Italian opera and Italian superstar singers. And Handel immediately threw himself into the operatic scene, and his connections with Italy were very, very valuable. His first London opera was in 1711 when he first arrived. It was called Rinaldo, and it's an opera that is still frequently performed today. It was produced at the New Queen's Theatre in the Haymarket. It was an immediate success. He continued to write for that company for several years, but it was poorly managed and failed after about 3 seasons. In 1720, the king chartered a new opera company called the Royal Academy, and Handel became music director, conductor, composer, and impresario. The Academy was supported by subscriptions from the nobility, but its financial base depended on the assumption that there would be a full house for every performance and that ticket sales would cover expenses. Anyone who's ever worked in the world of opera knows what a dream that is. So Handel became not only a composer, but because he was an impresario and was running an opera house, he had to become a showman too. So throughout the 1720s and early 1730s, Handel traveled from London back to Italy at least once or twice a year to scout and recruit the greatest Italian singers and pay them lavishly. From 1720 to 1728, he wrote more than 2 operas a year. The Academy was an artistic, grand success, but it was a financial disaster and eventually dissolved amidst internal dissension. It was one of the many times that Handel would go bankrupt in his life. He was an independent showman, and his fortunes rose and fell with the fortunes of the opera houses that he was managing in London. He promptly founded a second Royal Academy in 1729. It ultimately suffered the same fate in 1733. Now he's 48 years old, at the peak of his powers and undaunted. He is exactly the moment, age, and year when Bach wrote the letter to the Elector of Saxony asking to become court composer there. Both men in their late 40s are facing enormous crises professionally and personally. Handel had composed his very first oratorio called Esther in 1718 for the Duke of Chandos. Esther had much in common with the Italian oratorio as a sacred drama with sacred characters, biblical characters, and a linear plot. He composed no further oratorios while he was writing operas in the 1720s and early 30s. And then in 1732, 16 years after Esther's first performance, a friend and supporter in London revived it. A chorus from the chapel choir sang. The production was very definitely staged like an opera. The revival of the oratorio Esther was a great success, and Handel saw here an opportunity. He was determined to produce it himself the following year at an opera house that he was currently managing, the Royal Opera House at Covent Garden. The Bishop of London, who had oversight of the chapel choir, expressly forbade the use of a chapel choir in a staged commercial production. There was still something a bit unsavory about the theater, an impression that has not entirely disappeared from this world. So, the oratorio Esther was presented in concert format, and that has become the standard of oratorio production ever since then. The success of Esther in an unstaged concert version in 1732 established the English oratorio as a new musical art form. And although Handel continued to cling to the outmoded Italian opera long after its popularity had declined in London, he was also pragmatic enough to see the potential of oratorio, and he began to feature it in his opera seasons. The oratorios were then presented, as they are now, in a concert hall or theater, not in a church. The problem for Handel was that the London public was becoming tired of operas in Italian about gods and goddesses and mythical figures. In the 1720s, there was a new competitor to Italian opera. English taste for this Italian art form was waning, and there was growing interest in new English language operas like the one published and performed in 1728 by John Gay called The Beggar's Opera, from which we get Mac the Knife and all those wonderful characters from Kurt Weill. In the mid-1730s, Handel made one last attempt at an opera company. This time it was the theater at Covent Garden, but it too endured only a few years. Handel suffered a stroke in 1737, which left him partially paralyzed and unable to conduct. Amazingly, miraculously, he seems to have made a more or less complete recovery within a year, and he'd already begun to turn to oratorio because his energies were down, and it was much easier to write the oratorio and produce it than it was to write and produce an opera. And so, from 1741 until his death in 1759, he wrote no more operas and devoted himself exclusively to this oratorio art form. I want you to think for a minute what would have happened if John Gay hadn't come along with the Beggar's Opera in 1728. If the London public had remained enamored of Italian opera for another 10 or 15 years, we would never have works that Handel was forced to write to earn money. Trifles like Messiah, for example. This turn of events in Handel's life, which must have been quite a bother to him, is a total blessing to us because of all the wonderful music that we have as he changed his focus and began writing staged oratorios in English, most of them based on biblical texts. The one we hear today is not. And this one today was, second only to Messiah, the most popular oratorio Handel wrote in his lifetime. It was performed again and again and again. And it was performed in its premiere in 1736, just about a year before he had his stroke. It was performed at the Royal Opera in Covent Garden, and it was performed in a very distinct way, which I'll describe to you in a moment because we're partially reenacting that in today's performance. There was a great English poet named John Dryden who lived in the 1600s. He was born in 1631 and actually died at the turn of the century, 1700. He wrote 2 poems or odes to Saint Cecilia, who is the patron saint of music. Both of these poems were set to music by Handel. The first, which Dryden called From Harmony, from Heavenly Harmony, those are the first words in the poem, it was set by Handel in 1739 under the title The Ode for St. Cecilia's Day, and we heard that last year in our mission concert, the Carmel Mission. This is not to be confused with the setting we're hearing today, which was originally called the Ode for St. Cecilia's Day, but which Handel called Alexander's Feast or The Power of Music. That was the title under which it was published. Alexander's Feast was written in a very typically Handelian style in only 5 weeks. Handel was an amazing speeder. He was a speed writer. He famously wrote Messiah in several weeks before going to London to perform it. The amazing thing about many of these composers is that the music was already there in their heads. Mozart himself said, I don't compose this music, I just write it down. It was to Mozart and perhaps to Handel as well already, the music is already formed, and that's, I'm convinced, is why their handwriting was so dreadful. I know they were writing with feather pens, but there was so much to be said, and the pen could never move as fast as the mind could. So Handel wrote this music very, very fast in 5 weeks, within a month of its completion, and the ink being dry. It was premiered at Covent Garden on February 19th, 1736. The libretto from John Dryden was assembled by a poet and school teacher named Newburgh Hamilton, who made some minor additions, minor deletions, kept very close to Dryden's text, but did add one final poem that comes at the very end, and that is the very final chorus. It's beautiful music. I personally don't feel that the language is as gripping as Dryden's language. I've created supertitles for today's performance that are the complete text of the Dryden poem that's being sung. Every word that's being sung will be projected up there. The language is colorful. Rouse him with a peal of thunder, R-O-U-Z-E. Rouse him. And the use of apostrophes. Remember that in Handel's London at the time, if you had the word, let's say the word pronounced, P-R-O-N-O-U-N-C-E-D. In London's time, they would pronounce the final syllable and say pronounced. The words were pronounced. And so Handel, who is often maligned for having bad English skills, he didn't. He just had a bad accent. He put apostrophes in to make sure that people didn't put 2 notes in. And so you see lots of apostrophes in this music, and it's a way of designing the rhythm of the poetry so that you say pronounced instead of pronounced. And you'll see lots of apostrophes used in the text that we don't use in our modern English. The poem itself is based on a famous but historically unreliable anecdote about a great feast for Alexander the Great. He has defeated King Darius or Darius of Persia. And at this drunken banquet, he is induced by the Greek courtesan Thais or Thais to burn the palace of the former Persian monarch Darius or Darius, and actually the palace of Xerxes in Persepolis. It only gets more complicated. This all comes before the opening of the piece. This seemed a rather wanton act of destruction, that he should get drunk and go out and burn the town down. And he is shown being entertained at this banquet by the harp and flute playing Timotheus, who himself was a figure in Greek history. And Timotheus arouses various emotions in the listeners at the banquet by the power of his music, and finally yields the power to Saint Cecilia. And Timotheus was famous in legend for his ability to represent in music the phenomena of nature, the emotions of human beings. And it is finally at the end that Timotheus, it is said by the chorus, Timotheus and Saint Cecilia both receive the prize. He raised a mortal up to heaven, meaning Alexander the Great, and Saint Cecilia brought an angel down. Those are among the final words to this. He raised a mortal up to heaven. She brought an angel down. And that is her gift of music to us. Alexander's Feast was one of only 2 oratorios published during the composer's lifetime, and for many years, as I said, it was second only in popularity to Messiah. Mozart and his patron, Baron Gottfried von Swieten in Vienna in the 1780s, thought so much of Alexander's Feast that it was one of the pieces that Handel rearranged the orchestration to. I've performed that version, and it's delightful. Both Goethe and the German poet Herder expressed their great admiration for this oratorio. And in this performance this afternoon, we are partly recreating the circumstances of the premiere of the work. During his oratorio performances in London, Handel would entertain at intermission by playing the organ. He would premiere some of his concertos during the oratorio performances. In its original premiere in February of 1736, Alexander's Feast contained 3 interpolated instrumental pieces, 3 concertos by Handel. There was a concerto in B-flat major with 3 movements that comes almost at the beginning of the piece. And we are putting that concerto into that place today. And it will be performed by the eminent American harpist Cheryl Ann Fulton, who will be playing on a Welsh triple harp. I'll tell you about that in just a moment. That concerto appeared in the premiere of Alexander's Feast, right where we're putting it. At the end of intermission, in the premiere, Handel placed one of his own compositions, a Concerto Grosso. We are placing a similar composition in there because we're a Bach festival. We're putting in an orchestral suite by Johann Sebastian Bach. But not to be undone by Handel and all his world premieres, we're placing a world premiere within that orchestral suite. We're taking out the very, very famous air in G, and in place, we're putting an incredible piece by our Carmel Commission composer, Curt Cacioppo. If you applaud loudly enough at the very end, we will play the air in G as an encore. Now, Handel put another concerto down at the very end of the piece. People then, as now, found that anticlimactic, so we're not doing it. But this idea of these instrumental pieces in this work today is completely according to the way Handel originally presented the piece. Actually, to tell you the truth, Alexander's Feast is a little bit short when it comes to the length of standard concert pieces. So we're very glad to flesh it out with these instrumental works, and we're very glad that we can do something that actually evokes what happened at the premiere. The work enjoyed an enormous success at the time. Keep in mind, Covent Garden, the theater Covent Garden at that time seated 1,300 people. It was sold out. Several performances were sold out. It was revived the following year, and then 2 years after that, and then performed in Dublin in 1742, shortly after Messiah was premiered there. Various more performances in London in the 1750s. Handel made a number of revisions to the work over the years, partly to suit the needs of his soloists, and we are hearing a particular version today that involves the alto soloist as well as soprano, tenor, and baritone. Cheryl Ann Fulton is going to be our harp soloist today. She's an amazing performer. I've worked with her on much earlier music than this. We've done concerts of music of Hildegard von Bingen together in San Francisco. She's a marvelous colleague and is going to be playing a very fascinating instrument. 2 words about the Welsh triple harp. The modern harp, which most of us are familiar with, is a large harp. Lyon and Healy is one of the leading manufacturers of those harps. They're huge, big, gold, ornate things that have wheels on the bottom and have one layer of strings, and a bunch of foot pedals down here. And with those foot pedals, you can retune the strings very quickly, either in the middle of a piece or from movement to movement. The Welsh triple harp is so called because it has 3 layers of strings, 2 outer layers and an inner layer. Imagine 3 walls of strings. It first originated in Italy with 2 rows of strings, later 3. It became known as the Baroque harp, or the double, that was known originally as a double harp. It appeared in the British Isles early in the 17th century, and it is a beautiful instrument that is suited for performance of formal Baroque music as well as folk and vernacular music. As I said, it has 3 rows of strings. It's about 5 octaves. There are 37 strings in the principal row, which is the side played by the right hand, called the bass row. The middle row produces flats and sharps, and you have to reach between the outer row of strings and pluck the middle row to get the middle string. And then the left hand plays 27 treble strings. So this is it's a totally different procedure from the one we're used to seeing the harpist flat their hands against the string to dampen them all. Well, you would only dampen one of the 3 rows of strings if you did that. When it's necessary to change a key, you have to retune all the strings. If you're playing in C, you're fine, but if you want to play in G, you have to tune all the Fs to F sharp. If you want to play in F, you have to tune all the Bs down to B flat. There were lots of experiments to try and make the tuning quicker, but nothing happened until the pedals were invented. Today, the harp will be tuned for this concerto, and you won't be able to play anything else on it until you retune it. It's a beautiful instrument. It's actually a lovely instrument that belongs to one of Cheryl Ann's professional students. Cheryl Ann has been playing on the East Coast. Her harp needs to be transported here by truck. The heat in the Midwest is so terrific that she is afraid to have the harp shipped here. It's an enormous work of art. It's not just a musical instrument. So she's playing another beautiful wooden harp today that I think you're really going to enjoy. Now, I talked to you about the air in G. The beloved air in G is going to be replaced by another piece today which is already beloved to me. I am not just sucking up to our composer who's in the room. Let me just tell you some real quick things about him, then I want to bring him up here. He's a very distinguished American composer with eclectic and innovative interests that make him a perfect match for this music festival. He was born in Ravenna, Ohio in '51, began piano studies at the age of 9, received a piano performance degree from Kent State, went on to New York University where he earned a Master of Arts degree in musicology. He then received a Master of Arts and PhD from Harvard in composition and was on the Harvard faculty for 4 years before being appointed to a professorship at Haverford College in Philadelphia, where he has been since 1983. In 1997, he was given a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, an award that has been conferred on people like Leonard Bernstein, William Schumann, and Giancarlo Menotti. His catalog of 150 compositions includes commissioned works for the Emerson String Quartet, the American Quartet, the Moscow Quartet, the Milwaukee and Chicago Symphonies, and many other eminent ensembles internationally. His residencies and collaborations include residencies at 40 different U.S. colleges and universities and symphonies and festivals around the world. He's also a pianist with an international career and has championed the works of more than 30 of his composer colleagues. And significantly, he has had a dozen pieces written for him or dedicated to him by other composers in the United States and abroad. What these statistics don't tell you is that Curt Cacioppo is a composer of great expressive power and great emotional engagement, something that is interesting to me as a performer and as a listener. I want my head to be entertained and my heart to be thrilled. He will be presenting his own 1-hour lecture tomorrow called Channeling Tradition for the New Millennium. That's at 4 o'clock. Don't miss it. But I thought it would be great to invite him to the podium this afternoon and give you a chance to meet the man who wrote the new work we will unveil here in just an hour or two. So please join with me in welcoming to the podium Mr. Curt Cacioppo. How we doing? Number 2? 3? Okay.
One.
There we go. Thank you so much. Thank you. Now that I've totally embarrassed you by praising you to the skies. No pressure, Curt. Come on over and stand with me here.
Thank you.
I am so glad to welcome you here today. I think if I had a question to ask you, when the Emerson String Quartet commissioned a work from you, did they give you any input as to what they wanted you to write?
Well, that was an interesting story. I had no idea that I was under their scrutiny.
Mm-hmm.
Phil Manival, who is one of the directors of the Philadelphia Chamber Music Society, called me in my office one day and said, well, could you send a couple of scores and a tape? We were still putting things on tapes at that point. Could you send us a few scores and some matching tapes down here to the office? I said, yeah, sure, no problem. Mm-hmm. And I put those things in the mail and forgot about it for 6 months. And then the phone rang in my office again another time, and Phil was on the other end. And he said, hi, Curt. I have some news for you. And I said, oh, what's that? He said, the Emerson Quartet wants you to write them a piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And after I got up, having fainted and fallen on the floor, I said, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Because they're a super quartet. I'm sure you hear them out here all the time.
Yes.
And I was free to compose whatever I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And they being a super quartet, I tried to write a super quartet. And that was actually that was the first string quartet that I produced in a series of 4 quartets that are based on the Navajo creation story.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. After the performance of that quartet, I talked to the players, and Gene Drucker, who served as the first violinist for my quartet, told me that the thing that impressed them about the material that they had scrutinized, they liked the music, mm-hmm. just in and of itself, but the thing that really kind of pushed me over the top for them was that I was appearing as pianist in all of the performances.
Yeah.
And I could actually play the stuff. So that's how that all happened.
Yeah.
It was a challenging piece
mm-hmm.
for them,
mm-hmm.
But it was a great joy. That was a great collaboration.
What year was that? Do you remember?
Oh, that was mid-'90s.
Mid-'90s?
Mid-'90s.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an unusual quartet because Eugene Drucker and Philip Setzer switch as first violins,
right,
depending on what piece they're playing. And they're a great bunch. I've actually performed with and recorded with them a number of times. So I knew them back when. So my question then leads to our Carmel Commission this year, which is what I wanted specifically to address, because this is a piece that all these lucky people are going to hear. And my question then derives from what I just asked you, which is how specific was Paul Goodwin with you here? And or let me even turn it back to you, how constrained did you feel by placing you knew that the piece would be placed in this position, within an orchestral suite by Johann Sebastian Bach. I guess what I'm asking is very basically, what was that experience like?
Well, I came back in November from a series of concerts in Italy. All of us composers like to go to Italy.
Apparently so, yeah.
And there was an email that had come in while I was away, and it was from Paul Goodwin. And I didn't really know Paul until that time. And he explained the situation here at the Carmel Bach Festival. And by the way, I feel very much at home here because my life is basically a perpetual Bach festival.
Oh, good.
I think about him every day. Yeah. He's the biggest influence on my writing. Wow. But that said, Paul sent this email, and somehow or other he became acquainted with a piece that I had written for another festival, Baroque-type festival in Italy, but a Vivaldi festival. And I had produced an oboe concerto for that, and he knew that piece. I still have to find out how he became acquainted with it. That's fascinating. Yeah. Well, he's an oboist himself.
Yeah, so, it could be, yes.
And in particular, the slow movement of that piece, which is a largo. The thing about that festival, it being a Vivaldi festival, was, and they commissioned internationally, they commissioned tons of pieces from composers around the world for that festival. The only mandate was that your piece had to have something to do with Vivaldi. And in my case, I chose to base the piece on passages from the famous Gloria. And so I was already acquainted with this practice of interpolation and style mixture and so on. So he, I think, already knew that this would probably be a good match, that I would be a good person to do this sort of assignment. The third orchestral suite is one of the monuments, though that was a little bit daunting, and to be replacing one of the most famous lyric pieces from the Baroque period was also kind of...
No pressure, though.
Well,
no pressure
once I got over that, things seemed to flow pretty well.
Yeah. What I love about your piece, and I don't want any spoilers in here, or give anything away, but it makes clear and witty references to material, to sort of Bachian material. In the first articulations of the piece, there's a little turn of bass line that evokes that turnaround of the bass line that comes around, and yet you journey to places that Bach never went. You go to some really wonderful places, and what I like about the piece, I have to tell you here publicly, is that it did fill me with joy, both intellectually and emotionally, and that's very important to me, and that's what I like. I've heard bits of your music of the different genres that are available to me, and that's what I get from your music, and I think that's what Paul was looking for as well.
Well, thank you. That's a tremendous compliment.
Yeah. So how is the orchestra doing with the piece?
I said to someone last night, they wrapped their hearts and minds around it, and they've got it.
Yeah.
It's a real pleasure to hear.
You've done a number of commissions. What is it like for a composer to come to a situation like this, where I'm sure you have an idea of the music in your mind, and what is it like for you to hear it actually realized on the stage by others as you're listening?
Earlier in my career, when I hadn't had so many performances and so on, there was a kind of standard feeling of existential nausea.
Yeah.
That's not my piece, you know. But gradually, as I've worked my way up
Okay.
and so on, I'm dealing with the highest echelon of players, and I don't have that much to worry about. If we have things to discuss, it's on a level of refinement that maybe is even only perceptible to us. I mean, this is a fantastic group of musicians.
Yes.
And the choir, how many were here last night for the... I mean, the choir was fabulous. And the soloists, I mean, you have everything there. And Bach never got to come to Carmel. That's true.
The poor guy, he never did. I often think he would have been quite amazed and maybe flabbergasted and bewildered by what goes on here. That we take his church music and sell tickets to it with applause. What is... You mentioned that your whole life is a Bach festival. Can you be specific about how Bach has influenced you as a composer?
It's in the organization of parts, really. Bach is a contrapuntal composer, almost 100% of the time. And this is really something phenomenal. Even in the chorales, which we look at and it looks like chords, and so you think of it as harmonic music, not contrapuntal music. I teach those chorales every day. Soprano, alto, tenor, bass. You take any one of those parts, take the alto part, take the tenor part, any one of them. It could be the soprano. Every one of them is a perfectly shaped melody. And yet, they blend together in the richest kind of way harmonically. And this, to me, sets a standard. And from the time I was a kid, hearing those harmonies change and hearing the shapes of the lines, as they progress and intersect and so forth, it was just astounding.
There are no uninteresting melodies. There are no melodies in Bach that are simply there to fill in the old joke about the alto line. So there's nothing like that in Bach. Even the bass lines, even the attenuated bass lines in the recitatives have a melodic energy that moves forward.
And to me this is fantastic. And in every, for 100 years at least, 150 years, the Bach chorales have been a model for teaching harmony, four-part harmony. And rules have been distilled from the chorales. But I tell you, I don't use a textbook because there's a real problem in teaching these rules, and then you take a Bach chorale, and by the second measure, he's broken the rules that people derived. I don't know how they derived these rules. Every one of those harmonizations is an innovation. And there's 371 of those chorales in the book that we use, on a daily basis. I go through them, and he's also an impressionist. He's a great contrapuntal composer. And he was phenomenal in achieving these, you could call them democratic textures, where this would be a great social metaphor, wouldn't it? Soprano, alto, tenor, bass, each one is a fantastic melody in and of itself, and they all work together to produce a greater harmony.
Harmony is an endless metaphor for us.
Just phenomenal. But so really, since I was very young, the sound of these chord changes and the shapes of the lines and the excitement of the independence in the part writing, there's something very alive about it, electric. We especially heard it last night.
Mm-hmm.
You know, not just in the fugal writing, but even in the homophonic writing.
The clarity of the inner parts came through beautifully.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Well, I am thrilled that you're with us. I want to thank you for giving us this beautiful piece of music. I commend it to all of you, and I hope that if you see this great guy in the lobby, you'll shake his hand and thank him for being here with us. I'll introduce you tomorrow, too. I'll be here. Thank you, Curt. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's time to go upstairs and hear our tower music. Don't forget to go to the art gallery and enjoy this afternoon the power of music. Thanks.